Shehan Jeyarajah joins us, CBS Sports, was on with us last week, and I said, hey, could you come back while we have the last few weeks of the regular season up until the playoffs and into that as well? And he joins us on 365 Sports. Good to see you again, young man. What has been your take on the BYU Utah? We knew it was heated, but overall, Mark Harlan and what he said, what he did, and what was then done afterwards.
Well, I think that this was obviously always going to be a big game. We certainly expected coming into the season that it would be a Utah direction big game. Instead, it ended up being BYU. And I think for that reason, tensions were high. In so many ways, I think that Utah expected to be having the season that BYU is actually having. And I think that when you look at Kyle Whittingham, and look, they've named a head coach in waiting, it wouldn't be a huge shock to me if this was the last one of these that Kyle Whittingham coached. They had an opportunity to really come away with at least a successful game and potentially, come away feeling good about something from the season. So I think that's why it was so emotional for Utah, just because, again, they were not prepared necessarily for this moment. And look, I mean, for Mark Harlan, I think it was a silly thing to do. I personally am somebody who always hates coming out and calling out the refs and essentially claiming that something was stolen or biased or rigged or anything like that, because I just think that that shows a lack of understanding of how officiating works in college athletics. But it does make sense to me why he felt like, you know what, I at least have to come out and say something.
Yeah, it's just so I have this theory that if somebody had just gotten to him, they would have said, like, hey, before you go in there and do this, here's a picture of it so you can see what's going on. But I think he probably was walking through an echo chamber, and when he was like, I'm going to go say something, they're like, damn right, yes, you are.
Well, and, we're in this moment right now in college football. Obviously, a couple weeks ago in the Texas-Georgia game, we get the trash thrown on the field. Now that's become a consistent thing. Now with Utah, we get the athletic director coming out and calling out the officials. It seems like we're in a little bit of a crazy anti-official world. And look, I get it, right? Like, nobody likes losing games. These games are getting bigger than ever, especially with the expanded college football playoff. But this just isn't the way that you can treat people. This just isn't the way that you can treat officials. And like you said, I understand the frustration of that call being made on 4th and 10 with the game on the line, but it was also a penalty. Like they also committed a penalty on that play. And again, you can complain about the officials. You can say, I disagreed with the call. But I think to try and kind of go out and essentially attack their integrity in that moment, it's beneath an athletic director of the University of Utah.
Shehan, when it comes to BYU, what are you expecting tonight? Anything substantial in terms of movement? And how do you think BYU should sort of approach, if you're coming from that side of the fence, how should they approach maybe what they see tonight?
Well, I do think that it's more likely than not that they don't move very much. They had two teams ahead of them lose, number 3 Georgia and number 4 Miami. But they also have a team in number 11 Alabama, who I think is pretty likely to jump up ahead of them. They also have other teams in front of them that I don't think necessarily gave them a reason to move down. So I think that if they were to move up to, let's say, 7, I'd feel pretty good about that. I mean, the reality is you start to look at the resumes of everybody, and there are very few who can compete, I would argue, with BYU as a team with 2 top 20 victories at this point, still undefeated, but they haven't been treated like that the entire time by the College Football Playoff Committee. So I think that they're going to be in that middle tier. And if you're BYU, the other thing that I'd say to keep an eye on, well, 2 things I'd say to keep an eye on. One, where is Georgia in this? Because Georgia just lost their second game. It was a 28-10 loss against Ole Miss. It wasn't really all that close. So where is Georgia in relation to you? And the other piece is, where is Miami in relation to you? If you can be ahead of both of those teams, I think you should at least take a little bit of a deep breath heading into the home stretch.
Yeah, that's going to be interesting. And I brought this up in the first segment. I saw a couple of segments with Heather Dinich with Pat McAfee, and she was already positioning the 3-loss SEC team, although 3-loss SEC teams aren't like each other, but there's already that. And Georgia could have a 3-loss at the end of this weekend. Alabama could have, a 3-loss at the end of the weekend. You're smart enough to know, are they doing that proactively, or do they actually really mean that?
Well, I don't think that a 3-loss team is getting in this year, just frankly. And there might be years in the future where a 3-loss SEC team gets in, but the reality is it's not just outside of the SEC. Look in the SEC. There are too many teams right now that have 2 losses that would be there at the end of the year. And more likely than not, there's going to be, potentially a 1-loss team, maybe in Texas or Tennessee, but then maybe 6 or 7 2-loss teams. I don't think that a 3-loss team has any chance against some of the 2-loss teams that are going to be in the SEC. I look at a team like Missouri right now, who is not in the playoff conversation. Well, they'd still be a 10-2 team, potentially going against a 9-3 team. I look at a team like Texas A&M. I look at, there are so many that have a chance to get into that conversation, even just from the SEC. And that doesn't open the door, for example, to a team like a 1-loss BYU if they were to lose. That doesn't open the floor to some of the teams in the Big Ten, right? Indiana's going to be there. I think that they're close to becoming a lock with all of the SEC teams that have lost. So I don't think that a 3-loss team has any chance at this point. But I'm also the guy who thought that Florida State would be in the field over Alabama. So you can never count anything out.
Yeah, there's that.
Listen, man, you gotta bring it up. I mean, golly, it's like every time I think the beehive is out of bees to sting me, there's just another one that comes. You wrote the column on the tiebreakers this week, Shehan, and which one are you rooting for the most? Like, which chaos would bring you the most satisfaction?
Well, I do think that the Big 12 one, if Colorado had lost, would have been pretty funny. But, of course, Colorado wins, so I think that they're in pretty good position. The real good one, though, is the potential 8-way tie for first place in the SEC. That's the one that I'm keeping the closest eye on. I believe that it requires Texas losing to Texas A&M, certainly Georgia beating Tennessee, and I think maybe one other thing. And then you're looking at 8 teams, half the conference, tied for first place with a 6-2 record in the SEC. It would come down to tiebreakers at that point. And look, I think that maybe at the end of it, it wouldn't actually be that exciting. I think it would come down to the 4th tiebreaker, which would be essentially conference strength of schedule. Alabama rates really well in that right now. The other team looks like it could be LSU, which would have a 3rd loss. So like a team that essentially is already eliminated from the college football playoff for all intents and purposes. But that would be the funniest one to me, is the idea not only of 8 teams being tied for first place. Also, when you look at a team like Texas, that's probably the top ranked team in the SEC, and they would not be playing for the conference championship.
Shehan, I think you kind of already addressed this when talking about the number of teams with a couple losses and all of that. Is there any scenario the Big 12 gets 2 teams in?
Yeah, I think we're going to learn a little bit about that tonight whenever we figure out where BYU lands. If they land in the 6 range, I think that there's a case. If they're still in the 7, 8, 9 range, I think probably not. I tend to lean towards it being probably not just from the perspective of BYU, but you look at the other contenders from the Big 12. I thought that Iowa State was a team that had a chance to jump up a little bit and maybe give themselves a case. Well, after a 2nd loss, I think that's completely off the table. Colorado is a 2-loss team, but again, they're probably going to be around 19 or 20 tonight. That's just a long way to jump all the way up to make it as an at-large, and you'd be picking up a 3rd loss in this scenario. So I do think that it's really tough to imagine the Big 12 getting a 2nd team in. BYU as a tight conference championship game loser would be a close case. But like I mentioned, I mean, even the thing that factors into this is if the Big 12 champion, let's say Colorado or Kansas State or Iowa State, if they're like number 19 in the final poll and you lost that game against a team that the committee doesn't rate that highly, I think that hurts your case too. So if you had asked me 3 or 4 weeks ago, when you have 2 undefeated teams in BYU and Iowa State heading into this home stretch, you're in a great position. But with Iowa State's collapse, I think that BYU is the only one that should feel comfortable.
Shehan, with what Colorado's doing, and we all had an opinion about that game last week, to go into Lubbock and do what they did. And I was as impressed with the dudes that made plays on defense as I was the glitz and glamour and the stars, because they've got those, we know. I was very impressed with where they are now, and we've seen them do this compared to where they were in Lincoln back in early September.
No, and I would actually point to, it's funny, we all obviously first got to know each other when we were covering mid-2010s Baylor. And whenever there's a team that's so good offensively, and especially with Colorado in the passing game, I think it can get lost what happens on defense. I've made the case in the 2010s that Baylor doesn't win 2 Big 12 titles if they don't revamp what they do on defense. I think Colorado is going through that right now. And when you look at Colorado, they are really, really good at stopping the run. Against Taj Brooks, one of the best running backs in the country for Texas Tech, they shut him down for the most part. He finished with a lot of yards, but it took 25, 30 attempts for him to get there. And then that just lets your offense cook a little bit. You have opportunities to create opportunities in the passing game and to go downfield. And I think that that's been the biggest difference as the season has gone along, is that I think Colorado has been able to find something it can lean on defensively, and that's stopping the run. Now, look, I mean, they still have some issues, but the reality is, like, this is becoming a pretty complete football team, which was something that I don't think many of us anticipated when the season started. And as it sits right now, Colorado would be going to the Big 12 championship game if they win out. And I think that Colorado BYU has a chance to be a pretty exciting game.
What are your thoughts on if Texas does lose to A&M? Have you seen enough from A&M to think that they are a worthy playoff team, or do you think that that would be – I mean, obviously they might earn their way in, but what do you think about their long-term future should they get in?
Yeah, it's a good question. And the thing with Texas A&M is that they have things that they do well and they have things that they do poorly, and they're pretty well defined. They are elite at countering the run with their front. They are really good at running the ball with their quarterback. The issue for them that I have is that I think offensively, they're struggling to figure out things that they can do consistently. And after losing their top running back, Le'Veon Moss, I think it's only going to get a little bit more difficult heading into a potential college football playoff. Now, when you have a defense as good as Texas A&M, I think that it gives you a chance in almost any matchup that you're a part of. And that includes, of course, going and playing that game against Texas. But the question for them is going to be, can they generate enough offense? They've already made a quarterback change to move to a running quarterback, of course, in Marcel Reed over Connor Wegman. But that's my big issue, is I don't know, against some of these better teams in the country, will you be able to score enough points?
Hey, man, we appreciate it. Look forward to it. You got a game you're covering this weekend, or are you going to monitor from where you are?
I'll be running our live blog for Georgia, Tennessee over at CBSSports.com, but otherwise I'll be right here in my home office. So looking forward to this weekend.
Thank you, buddy. Appreciate your time. That is Shehan Jeyarajah, CBS Sports, with us.